And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program in the U.S. Capitol, where the first public impeachment hearing against President Donald Trump took place, with millions tuned in, not to mention many around the world. It is the first American impeachment drama in 2 decades. The testimony from the 2 high-ranking U.S. diplomats linked the president more directly to a pressure campaign on Ukraine to investigate political rivals. Before we get down to the discussion about what it really means, let's take a look at this.
I will begin by swearing you in.
2 career diplomats were sworn in as the first witnesses as the U.S. House Intelligence Committee opened impeachment hearings in Washington. At the center of the inquiry, did President Donald Trump solicit foreign interference in U.S. elections? Democrats accuse Trump of abusing his office by holding up military aid to Ukraine in exchange for a Ukrainian investigation into Trump's political rival. The top U.S. envoy in Ukraine, Ambassador William Taylor, testified he was alarmed to learn about the Trump administration's demands to Ukraine, included withholding military aid.
I found a confusing and unusual arrangement for making U.S. policy towards Ukraine. There appeared to be 2 channels of U.S. policymaking and implementation, one regular and one highly irregular.
Taylor said, withholding security assistance in exchange for help with a domestic political campaign in the United States will be crazy. I believed that then, and I believe that now. George Kent, the State Department's top Ukraine official, told the House panel of his concern at the idea of withholding military aid since Ukraine was locked in a conflict with Russia.
As a general principle, I do not believe the United States should ask other countries to engage in selective, politically associated investigations or prosecutions against opponents of those in power, because such selective actions undermine the rule of law, regardless of the country.
They testified that Trump wanted Ukraine's president to publicly announce an investigation into former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden, potentially Trump's 2020 political opponent. Republicans on the committee pointed out that neither diplomat had ever met the president and that their testimony was hearsay. Trump supporters say Ukraine's president showed little evidence of feeling under pressure from the White House. But perhaps most importantly, that Ukraine received the aid without announcing any investigation.
I'm too busy to watch it. It's a witch hunt. It's a hoax.
This is a sham and shouldn't be allowed.
The White House dismissed the first day of hearings, which will continue later this week, as boring and a waste of taxpayer time.
On the U.S. House impeachment hearing, let's turn to our panelists. In Washington, D.C., we have Bruce Fein, who is a constitutional lawyer, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. Also joining us in Chicago, we have Laura Schwartz, a former White House Director of Events. Later, we hope to also be joined by other panelists on the show. But first of all, hello to both of you. So I'm sure your eyes are just like many others around the world, gluing to the TV screen, trying to figure out what's going on. First day takeaway, Ms. Schwartz.
Well, the first day takeaway was pretty interesting. Of course, we'll say there's nothing to see here. It was boring. But in the opening statement of Ambassador Taylor to Ukraine, he mentioned that a staff member came forward in the last few days to him and said, you know what? I was sitting next to Ambassador Sondland, the ambassador to the EU, after a meeting in Kiev, of which President Trump, after Ambassador Sondland dialed him up at a dinner, said that he wanted to know where the investigation process was with the Ukrainian government. Are they ready to start investigations? And so already in the first few minutes, now we see that this didn't just come from Rudy Giuliani thinking it up or any of his other thugs. We see now there's a direct correlation from President Trump. Now, last night when asked about it, President Trump said, oh, I don't remember any phone call. I don't recall that. But guess what? That gentleman that recalled it to the ambassador is now summoned to Capitol Hill tomorrow in closed-door testimony.
I see.
Next week, Ambassador Sondland will be at a public hearing and asked about this very call. So he's kind of boxing himself in, not to say that, well, I don't Remember what we talked about? It was perfectly fine. No, he said he never made the call. That can easily be proven. So it's off to a pretty big start here in America.
Already a big drama for the very first day. Is that also your takeaway, Mr. Fain?
No, I think that if you are careful in following the release of the transcribed deposition testimony taken in secret and the newspapers report, there's nothing new. In fact, I don't think we have anything more than what was released over a month ago by Mr. Trump himself, when it was obvious by anyone reading the context that he was asking a favor to have Mr. Zelensky open investigations against Mr. Biden and his son if he was going to get these missiles and $400 million in military and other aid. So the narrative is still the same. I think that what weakens the narrative, if you will, is that the money ultimately was given, it wasn't illegally impounded, and no investigation was undertaken. So there was an effort and it kind of collapsed. It's the same kind of thing that Mr. Mueller uncovered with regard to Mr. Trump's effort to obstruct his investigation. Mr. Trump asked his White House counsel, he asked Corey Lewandowski and others to try to intercede, get Mr. Mueller fired, have Mr. The Attorney General, Mr. Sessions, not recuse himself, do other things, but none of them actually followed the orders. That doesn't make it legal, but it means that the punch is far less pronounced. And the other kind of irony here is that under the Obama administration, he rigidly refused to authorize any sale of what you might call combat military equipment to Ukraine. Mr. Trump, although reluctantly, did sign a bill that did provide for this aid, and then he tried to hold it up, maybe shake down the Ukrainian government without success. But it's a little bit odd for the Democrats and the Democratic administration that refused to give the military aid, then condemn the president because now he's kind of withholding it, but at least it was military aid.
Well, there's a lot of party line already in the answers provided by our two panelists, so whether we agree or not with one another.
But that's not even party line.
Yeah, let's go to Joe Rubin, who is also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State.
By the way, was okay.
Yeah. We'll come back to you, Laura. Go ahead, Mr. Rubin.
Yeah, it's just facts.
Yeah, so do you want me to break the tie?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, no, good morning. No, just on the military aid question, I'd love to talk about that for a little bit, about the Obama administration. That's really, the term is a non sequitur. It's irrelevant to the discussion at hand. The question is, what did the President of the United States right now do with what he had in front of him? So the argument about military aid, past policy, statements made to Vladimir Putin or Medvedev by President Obama to relay to Vladimir Putin, all of that is throwing up smoke, trying to confuse people, and distract from the core issue at hand, which is that the president clearly sought a quid pro quo and clearly is obstructing justice and denying information to the Congress to do a legitimately thorough impeachment inquiry, and he is right now getting away with it because his Republican allies are letting him. But that's what we're looking at right now. The other issues are sideshows.
I see. Mr. Fain, from another perspective, the public support, it seems, for the impeachment hearing, even though the public has not voiced necessarily whether they believe all the accusations are correct or not against the president. What do you make of that? It seems that majority of Americans, at least those being surveyed, are actually supporting this process. What would that mean for the electoral fate of the current president and probably even of the Republican Party?
Well, we know that impeachment is both a political and legal issue, and I do need to make an objection. This particular hearing was not at all about what I consider a really serious offense. In fact, it led to Mr. Nixon's article of impeachment number 3 that I helped draft for flouting a congressional subpoena. But I want to underscore, yesterday's hearing had nothing to do, zero to do, with flouting subpoenas, which would be a genuine, serious article. And pointing out the reason why Obama policy on Ukraine does have political relevance, because impeachment is political as much as it is legal, is because it looks like if you're trying to say that this very strong policy of aiding Ukraine militarily was undercut by this shakedown, It wasn't all wrong policy because it wasn't the policy under the predecessor. But putting that aside, I want to say that there's no doubt that the public opinion will be, if not decisive, very influential on how this unfolds. We already have 231 members in the House who have signed on saying they're ready to vote for impeachment, at least on some article, which is more than is necessary to send the article to the Senate for a trial.
I see.
I do not think, however, that yesterday's televised hearings moved the barometer one way or the other.
Yeah.
I think it was standstill, but you are correct that the public opinion will be decisive.
Mr. Rubin, on the other hand, will this be able to define, the stance of the Republican Party and also Democrats as we are seeing Washington going so much intensely into the election season? Will the president be toxic for his Republican counterparts? Will he be the biggest target that the Democrats could get hold of in terms of using it as a bomb for their own future? I know, Mr. Rubin, you're quite active politically, even locally at this moment. So what do you make of it?
Well, I think that the American people want to have a president that they have confidence in is working for them and not working for his personal benefit, and that's why he's in office. And that theme is going to continue throughout the next year into the next election if President Trump is not removed from office. The question about whether or not his policies work for the American people, but also is he working for the American people? So whichever Democrat comes through the nomination process, again, if President Trump stays in office, that Democrat is going to be making those arguments, and this impeachment discussion will be front and center. I do want to add, though, that the reason that I brought up the question about providing or blocking information or obstruction is because yesterday Republicans made it very clear that these two witnesses were third-hand or fourth-hand, not first-hand, but the Republicans are preventing first-hand witnesses from coming forward, meaning essentially President Trump has ordered them to not come forward. That's why it's an issue. We would love to have first-hand witnesses. Mick Mulvaney is a first-hand witness. The president is preventing him from testifying to a body where he was a member. That needs to change.
But on the other hand, Mr. Schwartz, would all of these really matter that much in terms of how the voters see who should be in the office and what are the priorities for the chief, shall we say, the chief of government for the U.S. Right now? Because the president, over the years, is well known for bringing his family members into the politics, and also well known for also talking about his businesses on the side of being the president of the White House. So would these really upset the voters much? What is the real fundamental issue here at stake, do you think, through the impeachment hearing?
The voters have definitely had, have let a lot of water pass under the bridge with Donald Trump and still support him as their base. I do just want, the gentleman right before me, really appreciate that. Great points based on facts. And let's let it be known that money that was being withheld from Ukraine was only released after the whistleblower's complaint came to Congress 2 days later. So when you get your hand caught in the cookie jar, you're going to put the cookie back and walk away and hope nobody notices. That's what they tried to do, but now we've got this impeachment hearing. It is a marathon, not a sprint. Right now, public opinion in battleground states for Donald Trump have not really changed. And the Democrats will look at that. So will the Republicans. Would they want to change their questioning from going around conspiracy theories as if they're trying to get along with the bully, Donald Trump, on the playground, or will they start asking factual questions? I believe that back in their home states, people want Washington held accountable. A big negative against Hillary Clinton that Donald Trump said through the entire campaign was that if Hillary gets elected, it's going to be investigation, investigation, investigation. And Trump was elected, and it's been all investigation. And he has yet to counter investigations with policy, with putting forth legislation to the Congress. Clinton weathered impeachment because he had a very high approval rating during the process because he was still getting things done, bills were getting passed, and he was working on legislation for the American people. Donald Trump's office really needs to take a page out of that book because people on the ground throughout this country during the election want to know how you're going to help their pocketbook,
I see.
how you're going to improve their health care, education, and more. It's still going to be focused on that.
Mr. Fain, how strong will the Republican Party be siding with the current president throughout this impeachment trial in terms of being a good runner on a marathon if the characteristics of the impeachment trial is exactly that, as termed earlier by our other panelist, Mr. Fain?
Well, I think that if the impeachment stays this very, very narrow, just on the effort, which was, I think, conceded to shake down Ukraine in order to get the money, that is going to hurt the Democrats more than the Republicans. I don't believe that by itself is really the egregious nature of the problem that's created by the Trump presidency building on prior ones, which is the usurpation of executive power to run illegal surveillances, spend money not appropriated by Congress, have people acting instead of confirmed by the Senate in positions at the cabinet level, fighting illegal wars never declared by Congress, claiming that you can stand above the law and flouting all these subpoenas. Now, I just want to add one more point. If the Democrats in the House believe that the defiance of a subpoena is an impeachable offense, and I think they are, they have to vote for it. They can't just say, well, the Republicans are complaining about it's hearsay, and so it becomes impeachable by osmosis. They have to be accountable and say, we'll do what was done with Nixon, and say, we think you're compromising our ability to get the facts. We're impeaching you and throwing you out of office because we can't make a determination without these access to the relevant witnesses. And that's not been done. The Democrats have said nothing in response to alleging an impeachable offense for defying subpoenas.
I see. On the other hand, we see more complicated picture than just the impeachment trial itself. On the other hand, for example, Mr. Rubin, the tax returns of the president once again has become a focus. So you got several layers of things going on about the president. Earlier, they were suggesting whether the president will be able to hold it back. Obviously, the latest from the appeal court suggests they insist on the earlier ruling. So how would this waves, of in a way, accusations against the president now work with one another or work against each other? Help us to understand this. Very complicated from Washington.
Part of what's been very hard for Democrats in particular to swallow over the past several years is that President Trump has gotten away, frankly, with multiple lies, obfuscating and preventing his information about who he is and his background to come forward to the light in the traditional way that we expect from our presidents, and he's gotten away with it and really has avoided having any of these types of scandals stick to him, be it his campaign's collusion with Russia, where there were over 100 meetings, that didn't stick to him. And now the tax returns, as you bring up, typically presidential candidates release their tax returns. Why? Because the American people deserve to know how they made their money and if they are extortable and if they're going to be honest. And the president, he has not shared that information with the American people. So far, no consequences. The challenge for him is, can he avoid that kind of transparency while at the same time avoiding transparency on his dealings with Ukraine and other issues? Turkey is now coming up, and that will be a theme in the upcoming election about whether we actually really know who Donald Trump is and the consequences of that for Americans, which are really impacting policy.
The rest of the world, we have to confess, it's not necessarily knowing all of these details and fascinating zigzaggings of all the hearings and how partisan politics would eventually work in every details, but people are interested in two things. First of all, Mr. Rubin, since you've been working for the State Department, so tell me about your judgment. How is this likely to have an impact on the current White House capability to put its hands on some of the most important issues that needs to be decided on? For example, about foreign relations, about trade, about domestic issues, about social welfare. After all, Mr. President was being put into the office as a result of so-called disconnect within the country. So, Mr. Rubin, help us to understand, what does that mean, that impact? Much or not?
It's significant, and policy decisions are only good and valuable if they can be executed and turn into reality. And that requires a government, and in the case of the State Department, an effective State Department. Right now, the State Department is in deep decline in terms of its effectiveness. The people there are demoralized. They've looked at their best and brightest being attacked publicly by the president, not protected by the Secretary of State. And yesterday was a good example where the Turkish president came and he got a lot of gifts, and the United States, I don't know of one single accomplishment that the president announced for the United States yesterday at the press conference. Turkey is an ally, a NATO ally. We don't want a bad relationship, but that's where the State Department comes in, and right now it's not functioning well at all.
Mr. Fain, you also work for earlier governments, at least from the other branch of the government. So what do you think will be the impact, you know, for others to understand the sophistication right now of the drama going on, Mr. Fain?
Well, I don't think, at least as the impeachment process is currently unfolding, that the impact on the institutional equilibrium, if you will, between the branches is really going to change much. It's very small, and obviously the State Department is demoralized because Mr. Trump was running roughshod over customary diplomatic channels. But that's not unique either. The State Department was demoralized when Henry Kissinger was National Security Advisor. He's visiting China secretly. The Secretary of State didn't even know what was going on. The State Department basically was operated out of the White House. That was demoralizing to the Secretary of State, William Rogers, and his subordinates. But those are decisions that the President has to live with. I wouldn't overestimate the suggestion that now the government has become paralytic because we have this impeachment. And when we had these processes that were actually much more protracted with regard to Mr. Nixon and Mr. Clinton, the government didn't stop operating. Bills were passed. We confronted the Soviets in the Yom Kippur War. So I don't think we can extrapolate and suggest this is somehow a clear and present danger to the ability of the United States to operate.
I see. Ms. Schwartz, same to you. You've been working at also critical times, I would argue. So how do you see this, you know, drama going on all over Washington would put its chemical impact, in a way, on the people-to-people relations within the White House, and as a result, influencing the policies?
Well, I really hope that people around the world do take away that this is a constitution at work, that the legislative branch is a co-equal check on the executive branch of the government with the presidency, and they are fulfilling their duties to guard the Constitution and through these hearings determine whether or not it's been infringed by the president. In the meantime, we have to remember that even Ronald Reagan, Republican president, got along with the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. President Clinton, a Democrat under impeachment, still got things done with the Republican Newt Gingrich leading the charge. Honestly, the civility in politics that the American voters say they want to restore election after election really has to start with their vote. And they've got to make their feelings known, because those members of Congress represent them, not themselves and not the bully on the playground.
All right. Well, a lot to discuss. I'm sure a lot to watch on as well. It's going to be quite a drama and quite a marathon, as you beautifully put. Laura Schwartz, Joe Rubin, last but certainly not least, Bruce Fain. Really appreciate, ladies and gentlemen, helping us to understand really what does it mean from inside Washington. Thank you so much.